I'm Rosalind Cavigan. I'm a researcher, I live in Edinburgh, and I am a trustee of the Scottish Women's Budget Group. And I'll be chairing the event today, which I think will involve, introducing people, keeping things to time, and also telling you what we're doing when we move into breakout groups and when we have our open Q&A. So this event is part of a series of events that we've been having over the last kind of 6 to 12 months, where, because we've been really lucky in getting some funding at the Scottish Women's Budget Group, we've been able to put on events and trainings that are really helping to re-energise our membership base and also get us as an organisation just doing a lot more and engaging a lot more. And so we thought, now that we've been in this more formal position as a actually legally constituted Scottish charitable organisation for a year, we wanted to have an event where we would be thinking about what we do in international comparison. And so we have speakers telling us about gender budgeting in different countries so that we can think about ourselves in this kind of international perspective. So the first thing to say is that unfortunately Elizabeth Klatzer won't be speaking tonight because she is sick, but that's okay. We still have two really great presentations who I'm sure will be able to fill up the extra time with great aplomb. So our two speakers are Anna Elamaki, who is in Germany just now, and she's a senior researcher in gender studies in the Faculty of Social Sciences at Tampere University in Finland. So she splits her time between the two countries. And her research focuses on the intersections of gender, politics, and the economy, especially looking at the gender impacts of economic policies. And she's very active in gender budgeting in Finland. So she's going to tell us a bit about her experiences there. And we're also really excited to have Catherine Scott here. We wanted to get a presenter from outside of Europe because, of course, unfortunately, Brexit happened and we can't just keep orienting ourselves to Europe anymore. We're having to think about where we are globally a bit differently. So Catherine Scott is a senior researcher at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. She is director of the CCPA's initiative on gender equality and public policy, which is called Making Women Count. And she's heavily involved in other ongoing research on social policy and on advocacy. So she's been in the community sector for the past 20 years and has written on a wide range of issues relating to social policy and inequality, and also thinking about funding for nonprofits. So any tips on funding, Catherine, we'll hear those too. We're happy for that. So each of our speakers will talk for about 10 minutes, and then after that we'll go into breakout groups. And we've thought of a couple of questions that you can kind of reflect on in the breakout groups, and then we'll come back for a Q&A. So we hope that, getting the chance to talk to one another will get your juices flowing for the discussion that we'll then have towards the end. But to kind of put things in perspective, I thought that I would share a couple of little facts or nuggets about where we are in Scotland in terms of gender equality and the kind of economic situation. So our gender pay gap is 13.3%. So that's too high, still too high. And in the context of COVID, we know that the majority of workers with the highest exposure to COVID-19 have been women. So 77% of workers in high-risk roles are women. We also know that in Scotland, women are more likely to be in low-paid and insecure employment. Of all the people in Scotland who are low earners, 69% are women. And just over half of people on 0 hours contracts are women as well. We've also seen these kinds of inequalities exacerbated by the COVID lockdown. So young women have been disproportionately likely to work in the sectors that have been hit hardest by lockdown. 36% of young women and 25% of young men worked in sectors that have been closed down as a result of COVID. And we also know that women are the majority of people living in poverty, and that female-headed households are more likely to be poor. So 45% of lone parents are living in poverty, and 90% of lone parents are women. So that's some kind of sobering statistics about where we are, and maybe help to frame why we do what we do at the Women's Budget Group, the Scottish Women's Budget Group. So without further ado, I will pass over to Anna Elämäki, who's going to tell us about gender budgeting in the Finnish context and what we can learn from her experiences there. Anna, the floor is yours for 10 minutes.
Okay, thanks. Wait. Okay, my slide should be up, is it? Yes. So I have been studying gender budgeting as a researcher, but I haven't, as Rosalind said, been very involved in the gender budgeting activism in Finland. So I'm going to kind of combine these two perspectives. I wanted to talk to you about gender budgeting in Finland, how it's implemented and what could be learned from it, but also try to apply these lessons a bit to the task at hand, gender budgeting in the COVID recovery policies, which in Finland has not been working that well, I have to say. Finland is an interesting country to learn from because it is kind of seen as this Nordic gender equality paradise, but it's this interesting mixture of relatively strong gender equality policies and institutions, but it's also a country known for strict budget discipline, one of the frugal four in the EU debates, or the frugal five. Finland has also quite a long history of gender budgeting implementation in the government administration, so soon 20 years in the making, but these activities are not discussed as gender budgeting. They are under the Finnish gender mainstreaming strategy in the government administration, which gives then the Finnish case a bit of an extra twist. There's four things that I wanted to raise with you today. So first is about the importance of strong national gender equality goals. The second is about being at the right tables and looking beyond the annual budgets. That's often the focus of gender budgeting. The third is the key role of civil society and feminist researchers, an issue that you all are certainly aware of. And then finally, that's maybe not a good lesson as such, but I want to talk just a tiny bit about the fragility of gender budgeting in crisis times, even in a country with a feminist government. To start, just a couple of words about gender budgeting in Finland. So there are three different practices that are in use in the government administration that could be described as gender budgeting, even if they are officially not named as such. So the ministries are expected to include gender equality statements in their budget proposals, where they describe the budget from gender perspective. All law proposals should have a gender impact assessment included in them. And finally, there should be a gender perspective in the performance management within all ministries. What has worked well or what has been achieved? Firstly, it's relatively institutionalized. So instructions for doing these things are included all the key documents that direct the work in the government administration. So it's, so to say, gender budgeting is kind of part of the everyday administrative work, or is not. The other thing that I would count as achievement is that the Democrats within the government have actually fought for this place in the budget book for talking about gender equality. That would have never happened nowadays. What works less well? Well, as to be expected, there are implementation problems. These three practices are not seen as interconnected, related to gender budgeting, but kind of as these different tasks done by different people in different parts of the administration. And then finally, there is this strong technocratic approach to gender budgeting that's really focused on processes. And there's hardly any attention paid to the actual policy content and the gender impacts of the macroeconomic policies and budgets. Going to the first lesson, the importance of strong gender equality goals. In Finland, it's quite clear that the lack of such goals, whether national or ministry-based, is something that really waters gender budgeting down. We see this when we look at the ministry's budget proposals and performance management documents. So these documents talk about gender mainstreaming or personal policy, but they do not talk about the substance areas of the ministries and how the ministry's substance is connected to gender equality. We also see the lack of gender equality goals when you look at the gender impact assessments, what's actually written in them. So it's really about equal treatment instead of broader impacts on gender equality. And this actually leads then to gender impacts not being recognized. The civil servants we have interviewed themselves think that clear objectives would really help them to understand what gender equality is and integrate gender perspectives in their work. And one could also assume that in the COVID context, such clear national gender equality goals could have functioned as some kind of a compass when the government was planning the recovery measures. The second lesson is related to being at the right tables. So in Finland, gender budgeting is really focused on the annual budget process. Yet in Finland, budgeting is dominated by these 4-year budget frameworks that are the key tool of budget discipline in Finland. All the main policy measures that are adopted by the government are normally adopted during the negotiations about the framework budgets, not necessarily when the annual budgets, where the gender budgeting is focusing on, are adopted. So the question is, are we looking at the right thing in Finland then? And in addition, silence about gender in these multi-annual frameworks and negotiations about them really reinforces the assumption that macroeconomic policy is gender neutral and gender is kind of a micro-level issue connected to specific policies only, rather than the big picture. During the COVID crisis, the 4-year frameworks were thrown out of the window, but the focus on annual budgets nevertheless was maybe not that practical, because it really prevented gender budgeting to be applied to these emergency budgets through which the recovery measures were adopted. So kind of what we can learn here is that gender budgeting should really adapt to shifts in public finance management and crisis situations. And following these established practices and processes is not enough. The third lesson I wanted to talk about is the role of civil society and feminist researchers. So in Finland, feminist outside government actors played in the last decade a really important role in raising discussion about gender impacts of economic policies to Finnish public debate. And this also then repoliticized this gender budgeting that had been done in the government administration. Suddenly there was talk about the gender impacts of economic policies that had kind of before been left aside. There were also some positive outcomes for gender budgeting within the government administration. So firstly, the government committed to starting to assess gender impacts of budgets and developing methods to do so. Secondly, the government has started to fund research projects that are related to gender impacts of economic policies. So there was one project about budgets that where I was the main responsible researcher together with my colleague Hanna. There is now an ongoing project about the gender impacts of COVID-19, and there's going to be a third project coming soon about the overall gender impacts of the economic policies of the current government. Also, we see that the Ministry of Finance has finally become a bit more involved. Before, in this old gender mainstreaming framework, they had no role in the development and coordination of gender budgeting. But now they at least have taken a role in seeing what's actually written in the budget proposals from gender perspective, and they are trying to make these texts better and more well-functioning. And finally, of course, there's much more public and political debate about gender and economic policy than, let's say, 10 years ago. But there's one challenge that I want to raise, and it is that in Finland, we really lack feminist economics experts, economists who would talk about economy with a gender lens, because what we have seen is that this status as an economist really opens you doors. It really makes the policymakers listen to you. And in Finland, we don't have that many people who would actually be in this position. When it comes to COVID recovery measures, well, the feminist researchers, me included, and the civil society were much less successful. And that kind of made me think whether this kind of feminist economics expertise would actually have helped in times of COVID-19, when this debate about the recovery was really dominated by a narrow group of male mainstream economists. And then the last point I wanted to raise was related to the fragility of gender budgeting in times of crisis. Basically, despite these commitments that the governments have made, despite us having at the moment a feminist government, gender equality simply disappeared from the Finnish COVID-19 response. So first of all, the few gender impact assessments of the key policy measures that were made were either not there or they were extremely weak, not even touching upon the fact that the pandemic might have gendered impacts. Gender was also not visible at all in government communications about the pandemic and recovery. I read like, I don't know, 800 press releases. There's nothing about gender. And then finally, there were very few policy measures directly addressing gender equality or unpaid care. In terms of violence, for instance, we know what a pressing problem this is. But instead of allocating more funding in these emergency budgets to shelters, the Finnish government allocated 20,000 euros for developing a chat service for a helping phone line. And yes, it's great that the government funds research about the gender impacts of COVID-19, lovely. But then at the same time, me and the other people involved in this project have really tried to talk with the key decision makers and get our results taken into account in policy preparation. No success. So here I don't really have any lessons for you otherwise than that I would just want to raise the question that what actually could feminist civil servants, NGOs and researchers have done better, and how to ensure that the government gender budgeting strategies actually are able to adapt to crisis situations. Thank you.
Okay, Anna, thank you very much for that. So we'll move on now to Catherine.
That's good. Thank you so much for having me. It's a real pleasure to be talking to the Scottish Women's Budget Group today. And I can tell you my father was very excited when I told him I had this invitation, as only a fifth generation Scottish Canadian in the diaspora can be. All very keen to be talking to the Scottish Women's Budget Group. So thank you again for the invitation. I work at the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. It's a national think tank, progressive think tank in Canada. We don't have overly many of those, so it's one of the few spaces that does lots of feminist public policy and takes gender budgeting very seriously. We also produce an alternative federal budget every year with a collection of community groups and labor organizations, which is an interesting exercise in participatory budgeting, which again has that parallel with gender budgeting and the work that's been done in the community to advance feminist public policy. So can speak to some of that experience as well. You know, I wanted to start off saying how I often look with, as a feminist researcher, with a good degree of envy across the Atlantic Ocean to see the wonderful work that feminist scholars and economists are doing in the UK, and in particular through networks like the Scottish Women's Budget Group or the UK Women's Budget Group. We in Canada haven't actually been able to sustain that level of feminist public policy engagement in the community over the last number of years. And you know, Canada famously has a feminist prime minister, but before the election of the Liberal government in 2015, we had a decade or more of conservative governments that systematically defunded women's organizations, eroded, eliminated pools of money that funded feminist research in academia, upended the 2011 census, which was a critical source of disaggregated information and data intersectional analysis that we used to support our feminist public policy research. So really, we've spent the last 6 years playing catch up and building capacity among researchers and progressive researchers, trying to make up ground for where we've lost. So that's really important context. So as I say, I look across the pond with a degree of envy of the sustained analysis, but we really feel that this last number of years has just been the culmination of, you know, many long years of trying to generate that kind of conversation in the public domain after this difficult time. And, you know, this experience has really taught us a number of things that I think I can add today around to the discussion, and I'll try to pick up some of the points that Anna was making, you know, about the critical importance of institutionalizing intersectional feminist analysis and why that's so important. This is much more recent in Canada than it's been in Finland or other EU countries. And ultimately, you know, the learning that, you know, this is really the first step, that the hard work of progressive change is always about community organizing and what the connection is between those two things, like doing the research and the gender, but how does that connect to change on the ground. So that's another learning I hope we can talk about in the conclusion, and certainly speaks to the work you're doing, obviously, in Scotland. So I didn't prepare a PowerPoint, which I could. I've got some speaking notes and happy to share my notes afterwards if people want to follow up. That's all good. So as I said, I've been doing gender budgeting work for a good long time. Gender budgeting really is important because it really strips away the idea of budget neutrality. It recognizes, of course, that budgets are fundamentally about people, and they reflect a set of values and choices that we collectively make about how to generate and redistribute a country's resources and income. In Canada, as I said, our gender budgeting legislation dates to 2018. So we're the new kids on the block on the international scene. It really was a significant milestone. It requires present and future governments to apply a gender and a diversity lens to existing and proposed policy and program decisions. Certainly, the Canadian government has carried out, we call it gender-based analysis. I know you talk about impact equality, gender-based analysis, and we now call it gender-based analysis plus to enhance, like to incorporate the idea of intersectional analysis. So that type of analysis in government dates back to the 90s, the first, when the Beijing platform and that whole flurry of activity that happened post-Beijing. So it dates back to that. But really, and it's only been in the last few years where the government's really taken it on and expanded its scope. And so it now applies to all Treasury Board submissions, memorandum of cabinet, departmental plans, evaluation. And now, of course, with the new gender budgeting legislation, it applies to all budgetary and financial management policies. So in Canada, from 2017 on, we've had separate chapters on gender equality in each budget. So that clearly seems to be a distinct difference with the Finnish experience, that very much the legislation requires not on a 4-year, every year governments or the departments are required to submit the proposals and subject those to a gender-based analysis. So the budgets have included a chapter that looks at different trends impacting women and girls and gender diverse people. We have in 2018, the government introduced a gender results framework that set out a series of goals and selected indicators to track the gender equality objectives. And this was loosely aligned with the UN's SDG process, which I'm sure is unfolding in different ways in other countries. So from 2017 on, each report has developed, has expanded in scope and depth in terms and quality of analysis. So we now, for instance, in the last budget, which came down in April, it included an update on our gender equality goals. There was a discussion of the impact on women of the pandemic and throughout the entirety of the budget across a variety of areas. It also included broke out data for the first time, looking at gender, but not only gender, but Indigenous women, like bringing trend data, women with disabilities, poor women, low-income women. So there was an effort to articulate the trends for those population groups. There was a separate annex that described, applied the GBA plus to each budget measure. And there was an attempt to determine what share of the budget, as measured in dollars, was directed to men and or women or other population groups. So for the 2021 budget, the government claims that 34% of all budgetary measures were directed or directly benefit women. It's the government's evaluation. It's a pretty rudimentary sort of analysis if you actually read the Canadian budget and looked at those particular calculations, but the effort was made. They also attempted to look at all the measures and determine which ones intergenerationally targeted young people, as well as the income distributional, the impact. So those measures that are targeted to low-income people, middle classes, our Liberal governments want to carry on about, and higher income people. So there was an effort to try to look at that kind of analysis and discuss that. I should also say that the Liberal government has put a lot more money towards Statistics Canada, and that's really been an important sort of policy that it has advances to produce disaggregated data. Canadians have been really poorly served by StatsCan in the past in terms of the quality and access of information you could access. You have academics, community-based researchers just simply not providing community level statistics, and that's fundamental to do the work that we do. So there's been targeted investments at StatsCan to create gender and diversity statistics. They have new data portals that they've introduced, some of which are aligned on the SDGs, poverty, housing, but there's a specific one on gender and diversity and inclusion, which includes data on LGBTQ+ communities and so forth. So there's been a real push to start introducing new flags on established data, surveys and data sources and so forth. So that's been really important. So that said, I would say the gender-based budgeting in Canadian context, and certainly the application of GBA Plus more broadly, is obviously still a work in progress. Canada has really struggled mightily with the implementation across all levels of government. And here, I think certainly our experience echoes what Anna is saying around, the implementation of GBA Plus in the context of the government. So 2015 Auditor General report, for instance, argued or found that GBA Plus had been applied inconsistently and incompletely across the whole of government. And a 2018 survey, for instance, of public servants said that fewer of half of departments and agencies actually had a GBA Plus plan in place, and that the bureaucrats engaged in that, like there was a high level of awareness of GBA Plus, but many of them simply did not know how to proceed, did not know how to apply, did not have the tools or the resourcing or the training needed to actually carry out effective GBA Plus plans. So that has really been a stumbling block in the Canadian experience. All very well and good to have the legislation bringing it in, but like, how do you actually drive it down through bureaucracy? How do you drive it down? How do you inform budget making processes? That's been a real stumbling block. And as I said, we've not had really great sources of information to inform that process. So you read the budget, you can be amazed that they're reporting out on Indigenous women and their sense of mental health or that. But I mean, that's the only variable they'll have. There's really a lack of comprehensive information they can draw on. So the federal government certainly has put some of the infrastructure in place. I guess the question at this juncture is whether it will produce results. And, I think it's compelling at first glance. So this is the challenge we have, isn't it? Like, in some ways, gender budget legislation is sort of low-hanging fruit. These are things, and certainly famously, the Trudeau government has introduced a number of these things. We've got new proactive pay equity legislation in place. They've certainly increased children's benefits. They've brought in more flexible parental leave. At the end of the day, I'm not sure we can really say this government has appreciably moved the needle on some fundamental things. Canada has one of the highest pay gaps in the OECD. We have, horrific levels of violence against women and girls, that in particular Indigenous women and girls. I'm sure that's sort of been reported here internationally, challenges we're having right now. I think certainly around the experience of migrant workers, all of which has been, of course, massively exacerbated in the current pandemic. So we have some institutional architecture in place with gender budgeting and those particular tools. We have analysis that's being generated, but what's the connection to the hard lifting that's work? That's the hard lifting that's involved in actually making a difference, closing pay gaps, addressing violence and the like. And, I would say, I wouldn't say it's all talk. I think there have been some, obviously some really important wins, but, it does come down to, what's needed to really drive change forward. So even in the gender reporting that's done, we have gender equality goals and a list of measures, but the two really aren't connected. Like there's no, global plan to move it forward. So an acknowledgement, but, there's been a lack of follow-up, and that's certainly what the women's movement has commented on. And it's been in a very challenging place. Like, how do you engage? You have a government that's nominally feminist and is saying all the right things, but not necessarily funding all the right things or making the policy change on the ground. So you're caught in between as an advocacy organization or a group that does research. It's a really challenging position to be in, like that sort of the action. And so, I guess coming back to what's been really important is like, what makes change? And so I always think what's incredible is the community-based research, such as Scott, your own group. Like, how do you take the the critical and fundamental insights of feminist economics and feminist budgeting and translate that into the community action that's necessary to support the change that will move the needle, that will close the gap, that will make a difference. So, and that's the process we're involved in right now. And I would say, actually Anna was saying how absent gender equality has been in their pandemic planning. That's not true in Canada. Like, you can read the last budget, it's all about women. They have established a Women in the Economy task force precisely to look at the feminist, the impact of the pandemic on women and what's needed to propel a gender just recovery. I'm not sure how that will all turn out. As I said, there hasn't been as much attention paid to, the mechanisms, whether it's progressive taxation, macroeconomic policy, and the like. So lots of talk, not so much action. And so we'll see in the context of this pandemic what it's going to be like looking forward. Certainly in Canada, we've had all of the devastation that has been brought around women who've been thrown out of work, those who have not had support caring. We've had in Canada the highest number of deaths in long-term care home, which speaks to, the tattered and flawed and highly, damaging, lack of investment in our care economy, and in particular in services for vulnerable seniors. Simply a national disgrace. So where are we going to next? So that will be the next challenge. We're in the context of a federal election right now. Some of this is...
Catherine, can I ask you to move to a close so that we can
yes, of course.
We have enough time for the other two bits?
No, for sure. So, I'll just, maybe we can pick it up later. We're in a national election right now. And some of this is getting discussed. It's certainly the feminist public policy government's produced or has pursued. It's attracting a lot of vitriol, and particularly women MPs or women candidates, racialized women candidates on the campaign trail have attracted a lot of vitriol and negative pushback precisely on these types of policies. And I think that's another important dimension of the advocacy work that's happening right now. It's a really contentious and fractious environment, all the more important, but challenging nonetheless. So I'll end there.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. So what we will do now is move into breakout groups. So you'll be automatically sorted into one, and you just have to click accept. And you might think you've been thrown out of the Zoom, but you haven't. It will be moving you into a breakout room. And we have 2 questions for you to reflect on in your breakout rooms. So we thought it might be helpful to think about, how do you think that the context we've just heard about compare with what's happening in Scotland? And what were the key lessons that we should draw from what we've heard to think about what we're doing in Scotland? Everyone is back now, so shall we try, and if we can take 5 questions, and you can do that either by waving your hand if I see you, or if you're very technically competent, you can press the reaction button and raise your hand. Okay, Marcia, do you want to shoot whilst other people are formulating?
Sure. So I'm trying to figure out which one. So I guess the first question I would ask is about the Canadian experience. I noticed the stress about the fact that there've been gender targets set, which is something we've been talking about in Scotland for a very long time. And yet I didn't get a sense that there was a strong accountability mechanism that then held the officials responsible when those gender targets weren't hit, unless the targets weren't particularly ambitious or, like bringing down the pay gap or whatever. So I'm really curious about what your experience with that was, and should we give up the idea of targets as being something that helps us build an accountability infrastructure? And I'm just going to sneak in one more. Very, very interested in the macroeconomics question and the lack of, historically, I think, certainly in Scotland, of linking up the gender budgeting perspective and lens with structural inequality as needing to be addressed by the macroeconomic stuff. And I'm very, I'm passionate about that. And I wondered what in Finland and Canada, your theory of change might be about trying to get gender more integrated into macroeconomic thinking. I'll shut up now.
Okay, anyone else?
Rosalind, there's a question in the chat bar.
Okay, so from Judith. Did Finland trail a universal basic income, and how did that work with gender budgeting? So that would be one for Anna. I would like to throw something in about thinking around how you deal with eye rolling. So Julie Bell was talking about what it's like being a councillor who's the person who mentions gender. What is it like to try and deal with that? And I was also interested if either of the speakers can talk about dealing with intersectionality and gender budgeting and this participatory approach, because on the one hand, gender budgeting is quite elite. You have to have feminist economics experiences. You need to know the elite language, but then there is these levels that Catherine in particular was talking about. So I think that's a total of 4 questions. Should we let the speakers respond?
Sure, I can hop in on the Canadian specific questions around the accountability piece and the idea of setting gender goals and targets. The government does report in the context of the budget on the general trends. They actually do not have specific targets. So they would say there are 6 general areas: economics, education, violence, I can't remember the other ones right now. And where they have several indicators that they've chosen. So they're tracking the indicators. They would report out on trend data, which is invariably 2 years later, in terms of the cycle of reporting. In terms of specific targets, there are targets they've identified through the social development goal process with the UN. Canada is famously bad at actually setting sufficiently high targets, liking to come in, obviously with mediocre performance and so forth. So there is loose reporting and accounting through the budget process. There's no formal report that's required to Parliament, which would actually be something substantive that you would report on every year and so forth. So you're quite right, Marcia, like the accountability mechanisms are fairly weak in that response. And there are not explicit targets other than that we want to close the pay gap. Well, we all want to close, as to how you're going to achieve and do that. I made the reference to this proactive pay equity legislation, which again, we're one of a handful of countries around the world that's introduced that at that level. But, the process was so impacted by consultation with big business and the like that it truly is the most wide, expansive 10 years out. Will necessarily precipitate huge level of litigation. You can just see it now. So it's that smoke and mirrors on that sense. You're right. Accountability is a key challenge. I can talk more about go to Anna, and I can circle back to the questions certainly about macroeconomic policy and intersectionality too.
Okay, great. The floor is yours, Anna.
Yeah, good questions. Thank you. I'm also very passionate about bringing gender equality to the debates about macroeconomics and macroeconomic policy, but I don't really have any great sorry. I don't really have any great recipe there. In Finland, actually, what we tried to do was to fly in, when we had a bit of money, feminist economists from the UK. So we kind of went this elite route that Rosalind mentioned. So we have really tried to work on with feminist economists internationally and have them then come to speak, because what we noticed is that the media is more interested in them than in us. So we got some quite good stories about gender and macroeconomics in the main newspaper through this strategy. And we also managed to then get meetings for these international feminist economists with key people in the Ministry of Finance. But there would be then, of course, other roads. For the universal basic income, yes, there was the experiment, but it wasn't really linked to gender budgeting. And I also didn't really see that much interest from the Finnish gender equality actors to engage with this experiment. So there were, of course, different rationales for why basic income would be good in Finland, but the feminist perspective was quite absent from these debates, despite this being an extremely important issue. Also, after that, in this experiment design or in the reports that were then drafted afterwards, gender didn't really have any role. There were no experts who would have engaged with the experiment from gender perspective. About the intersectionality, I will still say that maybe skip the eye rolling because, well, just shook your shoulders, I guess. You get used to it. In Finland, I think we are a lot behind here, and this is really where we have to catch up. If I think about the government administration, like what I heard now about Canada, about the gender analysis plus, we are not there. We are still kind of at the government administration level grappling with gender only and gender analysis without the intersectional analysis, but there is this move within the government administration to shift gender impact assessment towards something more like gender plus impact assessment. And in terms of like the few gender budgeting activists, we are not that many in Finland. I think it's also a perspective we haven't ourselves taken well enough into account. And I have this sense that also in our work, intersectionality gets easily reduced to kind of how policies affect different groups of women and men differently type of thing, like distributional impacts. For instance, we don't really engage with intersectionality and power. So I think this is really something we should take into account better.
I would have to say completely 180 on that, because in Canada, you cannot do feminist engagement or advocacy without taking an intersectional approach, right? It's just, you know, after the year we've had, the Black Lives Matter movement, Indigenous reconciliation has completely blown up in Canada. You know, travesty of all the children, you know, these issues are so pressing. And you have National Indigenous Women's Organizations, National Organization of Women with Disabilities, racialized communities are organizing separately. It's quite a diverse number of groups that are engaged, and they're taking space and demanding, you know, they're done. Like, you know, it's so a discussion about women just does not fly. And it's really challenged, certainly groups like ours, longstanding social justice organizations, to talk the talk and walk the walk around who's on our boards and who are we hiring and what are we advocating, and are we understanding how the impact of these policies and how they differentially impact it. We have to take distinctions-based policy, particularly as it pertains to Indigenous communities who have who are petitioning for more meaningful treaty rights and self-determination. So it's quite, and the government is engaging, because it's just no longer okay. In fact, it's really, you know, one of the big issues, for instance, that is dogging candidates on the campaign trail right now is institutional racism in healthcare. And what are you going to do about it? And, you know, it's a really pressing set of issues. So we're all in catch up and sharing space and power. So it's a really important pressing concern globally, but in progressive movements in particular.
Okay, Sarah, can I check? We're finishing at 7, aren't we?
Yes, we are.
That's when we're able to finish. Okay, Sarah, do you want to say anything about the exciting things we have planned for the next 3 years?
Well, I think that's going to come in the next, in one of the reports coming up next. But just to say, and there was some comments in the chat about things that are happening in Scotland, like with the minimum income guarantee, and we're hoping to be holding a good set of events through the autumn that will look at a variety of issues, including the feminist green transition and hopefully what feminist social security system can look like. So please do keep an eye out for these events coming soon, so we can all be part of the discussion and start get the advocating going for how this is included in the discussions. And then there's a few more comments coming in the chat, but I'll let people read them themselves.
Okay, well, it just remains for me to thank our two speakers very much. We know that everyone